So if you're here last week, you know that what we talked about was darkness. And specifically, the darkness that we can experience in life. The darkness that comes our way, sometimes darkness that we cause. So maybe we make bad decisions and that brings darkness in our lives. And if you're here last week, we talked about both Saul and Peter, two men who made bad decisions that put them in a place of darkness. And in those places, Jesus met them. And also, last week there was a psalm about, and we didn't know the exact details of that psalm, but in that psalm, it was very clear that the person was darkness, but not darkness that they caused. Something that happened to them. And this happens to all of us, whether it's illness, sickness, loss of a loved one, situations in life that get us down, just the world in general. There can be so many things that bring darkness on our life. And so this week, we're going to look deeper into what it looks like for God to actually meet us in darkness and to bring his light. Because what we said last week is that there is no darkness too dark for God's light. And I believe that. And so the question is, well, where is God in our darkness? And how do we find him? And that's what today explores. Specifically in the readings from John chapter 10. So if you want to turn there with me to John chapter 10. Verses 22 through 30. This is the gospel passage appointed for this morning that we'll be reading through. So here, real quick, I'll find the Pew Bible for you if you want to follow along. It will be up here on the screen. So John 10, and then 22 through 30, starts on page 1528, if you want to follow along in the Pew Bible. But as I said, it will be up here on the screen. So let's take a look at this story and see how God meets us in our darkness. But before we go to John 10, we need to set a foundation for this passage. Because when we read John 10, Jesus has something in the back of his mind that he's building off of. And so we need to understand that. And what he's building off of is our psalm for today. So let's just look at this very first line of the psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. So we just read this together. Also, this is one of the most famous psalms in the Bible. I mean, absolutely the most famous psalm, and one of the most famous passages of Scripture in the Bible. Most people in our culture, I imagine, know this psalm, even if they don't know what it is or where it comes from. They're familiar with the language because it's such a popular psalm. Now in the psalm, God is the good shepherd. The Lord, God, is my shepherd. Now it doesn't say good, I'm bringing that in from Jesus, but the Lord is the shepherd. And who are the sheep? The sheep are his people. Now, specifically in this psalm, the sheep is probably the author, but the idea is that all of God's people, and all people who want to come to the shepherd, are his sheep. So in this psalm, God is the shepherd caring for his sheep. Now, I have not been around sheep personally, but I know Kerry Steiner has raised sheep. You can probably ask him all about this later. And I have seen some recently with the proliferation of reels on Facebook. Those are those little videos that get you hooked, that you keep just swiping and watching. Now, there's been some reels. I remember one reel specifically where there's this guy, I think he's in a different country, and the sheep gets stuck in this deep, it's just kind of like a creek. It's not super big, but it's deep, and there's water in it. So the sheep gets in, and the guy crawls in and pulls the sheep out. The sheep literally jumps right in again. And he does it about 3 times, and that's the end of the video. And then maybe somebody will put something at the end of it like, oh, this is my life raising toddlers. Or anything, whatever you want to put in there. But this is what sheep are like. Sheep cannot take care of themselves, at least that's my understanding. Is that accurate? And unlike goats, which in the ancient Middle East, they raised goats, sheep, if they did not have a shepherd take them to water and pasture, they would not find it and they would die. At least that's what the scholars tell me. So, you can contest with them if you want to. But this is how sheep were. And so the shepherd was helping the sheep find water and caring for them. Without the shepherd, the sheep could not live. And so the idea with this psalm is that God is with us in life. He is the one providing for us in life. He is the one seeing us through our needs and caring for us. And then there's this very specific passage that you maybe know is the valley of the shadow of death, but it's been changed to the darkest valley in the NIV. One of the downsides of a newer translation. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I do like the valley of the shadow of death a lot better. I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Now, the psalmist doesn't say what this valley of darkness is. He just says it's a dark valley. It's this place of danger, of fear, of evil. I think for us, what we put in that category is whatever we fear most, whatever is in our heart that we're most scared of, that we're so worried about. Our greatest fear. And God meets us and leads us through. So this is this idea in the background from the Hebrew Bible from the Old Testament. And then we get Jesus. So let's go to Jesus now in John chapter 10, starting in verse 22. Then came the festival of dedication at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was in the temple courts, walking in Solomon's colonnade. All right, so we have been in John a lot after Easter, but we've been a lot further into the book. This is all the way in chapter 10. So Jesus and his disciples, they go to Jerusalem. They go for the festival of dedication. Now, you might be wondering what this festival is. So if you're really astute, I'm not expecting anybody to be this astute, you would go to try to find those places in the first 5 books where it talks about those festivals they're supposed to celebrate. There's like 3 or 4 of them. I can't remember how many. Now, if you go there, you're not going to find this one. There's no festival of dedication that Moses says you're supposed to celebrate every year. So where does it come from? Well, we actually know this festival by a different name, and I guarantee you're going to know the festival when you hear the name. The name this is called today is Hanukkah. Now, you might not know anything about Hanukkah, but you know that it's kind of like Christian, but it's what Jewish people observe. You might know that song that Adam Sandler sang on Saturday Night Live, or that dreidel song. I don't know. Hanukkah is the festival of dedication. Now, it is remembering the Maccabean revolt, another thing that you know nothing about, right? So the Maccabees were a family of Jews in the right before the first century. During Alexander the Great, after he died, there were some people who took his kingdom, they split it up to a couple different places, okay? And there was a lot of political upheaval, and this Maccabean family was able to revolt against what had been the Greeks and get freedom. So for about, I don't know how many years, 50 to 100 years, the Jewish people, right before the first century, had freedom. And they were free. They were able to do what they needed to do to care for themselves. And this remembers the Maccabean revolt. And what ended up happening later on in the Maccabean revolt was that there was the Romans threatening to come, and so the Jewish people said, hey, Pompey, we will we will give ourselves to you if you protect us. And he proceeds to go into the Holy of Holies in the temple and desecrate it and say, I don't care about your God. So that's what happened. But for a little bit of time, the Maccabees got freedom. And so the Jewish people remembered that with the festival of dedication. So they're there celebrating this festival. It's winter. Jesus is at the temple of and he's walking through Solomon's colonnade, which is this outer part of the temple. They had these porches, they called them. There'd be like columns, and there'd be roofs over, and it'd be like cool. And people would sit there and gather and teach and different things. And so he's walking in the temple, and then he has this conversation. And here's the conversation, starting in verse 24. The Jews who were there gathered around him, saying, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly. So remember, this is a lot earlier in Jesus' journey, his story. And so there's these rumors about him being the Messiah. He is in Jerusalem. And so people start to question him. Hey, are you the Messiah? Tell us if you are. We want to know. They want to know if he's the Messiah. So Jesus answers, verse 25. Jesus answered, I did tell you, but you do not believe. The works I do in my Father's name testify about me, but you do not believe, because you are not my sheep. So there's the sheep. What's this all about? So Jesus says, you would know I'm the Messiah if you trusted my work that I'm doing in my Father's name. So what is this work? Any and all the things that he's done. The time where he turned water into wine at the festival, or the wedding in Cana. Healing people, casting out demons. Also, there's one more I'm thinking of here, the feeding of the 5,000s. All of these things that happened. Jesus said, if you believe based on these tests that testify about me, you would know who I am. He says, but you do not believe because you are not my sheep. So why does he bring sheep into the story now? Where do sheep come from? Well, if you actually were to go back earlier in chapter 10, there's the parable of the good shepherd. You maybe know this parable, where Jesus talks about being the good shepherd who cares for his sheep. And he talks about people who come in outside of the sheep pen and try to steal the sheep. But the shepherd is there, and his sheep know his name, and they know his voice, and he knows them. And so there's these, and that actually might be two different parables. I'm trying to go off the top of my head, where he says, I am the good shepherd, and he talks about caring for his sheep. And so he says to these Jewish people, you don't know me because you're not my sheep. If you were my sheep, you would know me, and you would know who I am. So this is Jesus using that idea of Psalm 23. And that's just one of many examples in the Old Testament of God saying he's the shepherd of his people. And now Jesus steps into that place and says, I am actually the shepherd. I care for my sheep. They know me and I know them. And then he says this, verse 27. He says, my sheep listen to my voice and I know them and they follow me. So if you're sitting here wondering, well, how do I know if I'm a sheep? Am I a sheep? Do I want to be a sheep? Jesus says that his sheep know his voice and they follow him. Now, I don't want to make too much about this. I don't want to sit here and say that there's a certain formula you have to figure out, and if you don't get it, you're wrong. I want to say, trust Jesus. I want to say, put your faith in him. Give him your allegiance. Say you are going to follow him, and you're going to trust that he says who he says he is. And if you do this, you will learn his voice over time, and he will know you. The reason the people rejected Jesus was because they just didn't trust him. But if you trust Jesus, if you give your life to him, you are his sheep. And then this is what he says about his sheep in verse 28. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all. No one can snatch them out of my Father's hand. I and the Father are one. Jesus gives his sheep eternal life, which just refers to life in the world to come for the Jewish people. What we would call the new heavens and the new earth, when our bodies will be resurrected and restored. Jesus gives us this life if we're his sheep, and no one can take us from him. Now, I don't think that means that we can't walk away. We can walk away. And then how he sorts that out, I don't know. But what I can say is if you are faithful, nothing can pull you from God. Because the Father, as he says, my Father, if you're in my Father's hand, nothing is greater than him. So we think back now to Psalm 23. Jesus is the shepherd walking with us in that dark valley. He's with us in the middle of it. He's guiding us through it. So how does God's light get into the darkest places? Well, it's because God's already there with us. Sometimes we just need to look at him and see him. Because in our darkest valleys, Jesus is with us. It doesn't matter what the valley is. It doesn't matter if you've caused it or you haven't. Jesus is with you. He's going with you through that darkness, and he will never abandon you. In our darkest valleys, Jesus is with us because he is the good shepherd. Now, you might not believe me, or you might say, are you sure? So let's just look at these couple verses from Revelation. This first one, we're going to have to work through this and make sure we understand what's going on. So 7:9, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. So there's this multitude that John the Seer, as we call him, the guy who has this vision in Revelation, and he sees this multitude. So we go from Jesus at the temple in Jerusalem to the holy temple in the throne room of God. Now remember, the temple on earth is supposed to be God's dwelling place. But he really dwells in heaven, or in his place in the heavens. And this is his throne room. And in his throne room, there are a multitude from every nation, every tribe, every people, and language, standing in the presence of the Lamb. So who is this multitude? Well, we're going to find out in a moment. But who is the Lamb? We can talk about the Lamb. The Lamb is Jesus. He is the slain Lamb who sits on the throne. And these people are in his presence, worshiping him. So who are the people? So we jump down to 13. Then one of the elders asked me, John the seer, he says, these white robes, who are they? Are these in white robes? Who are they? And where did they come from? So John says, I answered, sir, you know. He says, you know, I don't. And he, the elder, said, these are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Now, this is probably one of the most controversial verses in American Christianity. I say that because most Christians in most places around the world did not care about this verse, like beyond just normal, it's there, we want to understand it. But this verse has been used to build million-dollar platforms of books and ideas. We have some of those books down in our fellowship hall right now. And there's a couple movies in the 90s maybe you saw about the Great Tribulation. What I'm going to say is it's not clear at all exactly what this means. Great Tribulation comes from the book of Daniel, and it refers to the period of persecution before the end when the Lamb, or that in that place, the Son of Man comes to sit on his throne. So this could be what we experience today, and I think that's the best way to look at this. The Great Tribulation is just life, all right? Now, we don't want to trivialize the fact that there have been Christians in history who have had a lot harder life than us, right? We need to acknowledge that right now. But there's still things about our life that are hard. There's things about our life that aren't easy to always live up to. It's not always easy to be faithful and to follow Jesus and to live his way. Those who get through that challenge, that great tribulation, and make it to the time with Jesus, they have these white robes purified by the blood of the Lamb, which it means that they are able to be holy and enter the presence of God. That's all it means. It's not as if the blood should turn it red, but it turns it white or anything. The blood is a symbol for purification. They are now able to enter God's presence and be with God because of their faithfulness. That's all it's about. So in this scene, people who are faithful because the Lamb is with them as their good shepherd. Look what it says here. Never again will they hunger. Never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. So this is looking forward, but it also looks back. And it also looks to right now. The Good Shepherd is with us. In our darkest valleys, Jesus is with us. He's walking with us. He will not abandon us. And one day we will be with him, and he will care for us in a world that we cannot imagine that is whole and holy and good and just, where there is harmony. But in the meantime, in our darkest valleys, Jesus is with us. So on this fourth Sunday of Easter, as we think about what does it mean for Jesus to be resurrected, it means that darkness in our lives has no hold, because the light of God can shine in that darkness, because we have a good shepherd who walks in the darkness with us. In our darkest valley, Jesus is with us. So I don't know what your darkness is. I don't know what you're experiencing. I don't even know if you would call it darkness. But Jesus is with you. He's the good shepherd. The reason that you don't know him is because you haven't heard him, or he's speaking to you and you're not listening. Now, I'm a fan of the books, The Chronicles of Narnia. Who's heard of those books? I know my kids like them. Okay, so in the first book, that's technically not the first book, but it's now the first book. I know that's confusing. It's the first book in the series. It was not the first book published. It's a prequel that C.S. Lewis wanted to be first, but he wrote it later. It's called The Magician's Nephew. In The Magician's Nephew, there are some humans that get into Narnia, and they meet Aslan, who's Jesus. Now, one of these humans is this older man, and he is the wizard, or he's the magician. He's the one that was able to get them there. But once he realizes his magic actually works, he's terrified, and he doesn't want anything to do with magic anymore. But he gets there, and he meets Aslan, and he's scared of Aslan, and he views them as this terrible beast, because Aslan is a lion. Now, the kids ask Aslan, because there's a couple of kids there as well, they say, "Can you do anything for this man? He's so scared." because he's in Narnia and he thinks that you're going to kill him, and there's all these wild animals that are around him. Now, the wild animals talk because they're talking Narnia animals, but he can't hear them. And Aslan says, he's like, unfortunately, I can't speak to him because he will not listen to me. He says, all I can do is put him to sleep. How often do we not hear Jesus' voice because we're not listening? That's what Lewis understood. If we don't know how to listen for the voice of the shepherd, we're not going to hear it. But if you want to listen, you just start listening. You just turn that trust a little bit. You say, you know what, this Jesus story, I think I might be true. I'm going to find out more about it. And you just go. And Jesus will meet you there. Because in our darkest valley, Jesus is with us. And my invitation for you today is to look for him in your darkness and let him show you his light.